Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Curtis, and today we're going to be talking about my go-to wildlife photography settings on the a7 IV. The settings I'm going to share with you in this video have proven to work for me time and time again. So use this as a starting point and don't be afraid to experiment. Okay, so let's start with some of the custom buttons I have set up on my a7 IV. I have my camera set up for back button focus. I was completely against this at first as it just felt unnatural and I didn't understand the benefits. It separates your focus and your shutter button so that you can continue to stay locked on with the back button while taking photos separately. It gives you a little bit more flexibility, and honestly, once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. Next, I have C1 customized to animal and bird eye autofocus, so I can quickly switch between the two when I'm out hiking, because you never know what you might come across. Now this next one comes in handy when your eye autofocus won't detect the subject. Maybe it's a bird within a bunch of foliage. I have the AEL button set to crop mode, or APS-C mode, which allows me to quickly crop in 1.5 times. And of course you do lose some megapixels doing this, but sometimes I find this helps the camera detect the subject so that it can catch the eye. Then I just simply press the button again and I'm back to the full image and taking photos with eye autofocus engaged. Now for the next one. When every tiny movement and sound is on the line, when you've stumbled across a sensitive species or vice versa, you might not want the sound of your shutter ruining the moment. I've been in this situation a handful of times. So I programmed C2 to turn on and off the silent shutter feature. Keep in mind that a silent shutter can give you some strange artifacts when photographing fast-moving subjects or waving your camera back and forth. It's definitely more reliable in those quiet, still moments. There's been a few instances where I quickly move the camera up to my face and my nose hits the screen, moving the autofocus box way off to the side, and then I miss the shot. So I have C4 customized to enable and disable the touchscreen functions of the camera. I really only seem to use the touchscreen when I'm filming on a tripod because I can simply tap on the screen to start tracking a subject. Okay, so that's enough custom buttons. Let's dive into the actual settings of the camera. First things first, I'm all about uncompressed RAW to get the most out of my photos. And of course this is paired with continuous shooting on high. However, one important thing to note when shooting in uncompressed RAW, you can only capture 6 photos per second. So if you're in need for speed, switch over to compressed RAW for a maximum of 10 photos per second, or 10 FPS. Thankfully, compressed RAW appears to have minimum to no quality loss at all. But of course, that's up for debate. So this next part is really important, and I'd be interested to hear what you guys are using. For my focus area, I mainly use this option all the way at the bottom of the menus, called tracking. Now within tracking, there's a whole variety of different options. I often use the center, medium, or large tracking option. However, if I'm trying to shoot between something, the smallest option can be a better choice. Then, when the birds take flight, I switch over to a wide tracking zone. That way the subject won't have to be perfectly centered as it moves unpredictably through the sky. Now, I thought I would quickly touch on shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Although I'm not going to dive too deep into the explanation of these settings are always changing from scene to scene, and more often than not, I screw them up, but that's just the way of wildlife photography. It's a lot of trial and error. For fast-moving subjects, I crank the shutter speed up. That being said, I don't shy away from lower shutter speeds. If my subject is still enough, I've shot as low as 1/100th of a second, handheld, thanks to the in-body and optical stabilizations of the lens. I typically leave my aperture wide open at f6.3. That's as low as my lens will go. However, sometimes it's useful to close your aperture. By closing your aperture, you let less light into the camera and begin to make things a little bit sharper, similar to squinting your eyes to try and focus on something. It's also going to affect the depth of field. With a higher aperture, it's going to widen your depth of field so that your subject is more in focus. Now, as for my ISO when I'm out taking wildlife photos, I essentially have it on a controlled autopilot. With auto ISO, I can maintain the same exposure throughout a changing scene. Now, if I find the photos are too bright or too dark, that's where my customized exposure compensation dial comes into play. With a quick twist, I'm telling the camera to use a lower or a higher ISO. Another way I control exposure in my scenes is with metering modes. Metering modes tell the camera what part of the scene to base its exposure off of. I typically leave my metering mode on multi, which balances the whole scene. But in the case for this photo behind me, I use center spot metering, which tells the camera that I want to expose the center of the image, which in this case is the heron standing within the light. This caused the already dark background to completely blacken out as the camera exposed strictly for the bright heron. Multi-metering, on the other hand, would have attempted to balance the exposure across the entire scene. So that's how I have my Sony a7 IV set up and how I typically use it when I'm out taking wildlife photos. What techniques do you use? I'd be interested to hear about them in the comments below. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. If you did, don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.